Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the News Behind the News with Rav Kintav on Mix 94.7 FM, and thank you for joining me on today's program. Today's episode will be quite the interesting one as we're delving into the world of history, a history that is part of world history, or regional Caribbean history, European history, and right here locally in St. Martin, as it relates to a book that we'll be delving into for today, titled An Afro-Caribbean in the Nazi Era, from Papiamento to German. And for today, delving into this topic will be Miss Mary Romney, who is the author of this book, which basically relates to stories and the history of her father, who ended up in a concentration camp in Austria. So I would like to welcome you so much, Miss Romney. Thank you so much for being on the program. It's a pleasure to have you.
Well, it's an honor to be here with you, Mr. Kantav. I'm very, very grateful for the opportunity to speak with you. Thank you very, very much.
My pleasure. And I'm glad that you're here. As I was sharing off air, before the hurricane damaged the library, and the library made some improvements, and one of the other wings that it improved, I think it was basically like a media room. There was this collection dedicated to African history, and the history of the African diaspora, Caribbean history. And I was in love with that section of the library because I devoured it, basically. I read so many books from it.
That's wonderful.
And to know that you were the one who dedicated and contributed all those books, it means a lot to me. And thank you for that gift that you gave to St. Martin. It didn't go to waste. It definitely didn't.
Well, I appreciate that very deeply. It's very gratifying for me to hear that you were able to learn from it, that you were able to benefit from it, that you were able to enjoy it.
For sure.
So thank you very much for reading those books, for watching those DVDs. I think that's all. It also says a lot about you.
Appreciate it.
So thank you so much.
Indeed.
I appreciate that very much.
So can you tell us a bit about yourself, and how did you end up hearing about this story related to your father?
Well, I'm not a professional historian. My profession is the teaching of English to speakers of other languages. As we know, the United States is a country of immigrants, and many of them, if not most of them, come to the United States without knowing any English. So people like me are dedicated to teaching English to them. I've also done it abroad. I lived in Spain for many years, where I also taught English as a foreign language. So that's my profession. But my path to my father's story started really here in St. Martin. Many years ago, maybe when I first started coming here regularly in the late 80s, I believe it was, the mid to late 80s, I realized that I didn't know that much about the history of St. Martin. I wanted to learn more, so I started looking for history books, but I couldn't find any. I finally found one or two, but that was all I could find in those days. And then I started coming here with my parents, and then later with my father. And I found that I was fascinated by the conversations that my father had with people like Emilio Wilson, who was his best friend when they were children. And they were friends for over 80 years. And I really enjoyed listening to their conversations. I also loved listening to my father's conversations with his brother and other people in that generation. And I just couldn't figure out why I enjoyed it so much. But then eventually I discovered that the history of St. Martin was in the memories of those old people.
Yes.
So I said, well, yeah, you understand that. I know that you're somebody who definitely understands that, and I admire what you've done as well. But I started realizing that if I didn't record those conversations, I wouldn't be able to remember them, and they would be lost forever. And I felt that they were of great historical value and great personal value to me and my family. So I started recording these, and in the meantime, I started recording them because I wanted to know something about the history of St. Martin, and I also wanted to learn more family history. But in the meantime, I really wanted to learn more about. I wanted to learn something about my father's World War II experience. which he avoided talking about for over 40 years. And it took me over 20 years to finally get him to talk about it.
Oh.
But that was because he was in trauma.
Was it your mom who alerted you that your father had that experience?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I found that out when I was 15 years old. I was always asking my parents about their early lives, and my mother was very forthcoming. So I had that contrast with my father, who was not forthcoming at all. He would talk a little bit about St. Martin. I mean, this was before I started coming here and started trying to find out more about the history of St. Martin and the history of the family. So, when I was very young, I started, I as children always do, they ask about their parents' early lives. So I did that with my parents. And my father talked a little bit about his early life in St. Martin, and then his early life in New York City, which was many years later. That didn't start until the mid to late 40s. So I began to realize as I got older that there was a gap in what he was saying. And then as I got even older, I began to realize that the gap was actually the World War II years. And I couldn't get him to talk about it. No matter what I asked him, he just wouldn't talk about it. He didn't refuse. He just passively resisted. But I was curious. So finally, when I was 15, I asked my mother, I said, well, do you know anything about what happened to Dad in World War II? Where was he? I think he said something about Italy, but where was he in World War II? What happened? And she said, well, he was in a German concentration camp. And that was extremely shocking to me.
Yeah.
I still remember the impact, the emotional impact, and even the physical impact. I remember how shocking it was for me. That's something that you feel throughout your whole mind and
core,
body.
Yeah. That's
exactly right, to your core. Because I wasn't expecting it. I had no way of expecting that. So then she said, he suffered terribly. They didn't have enough food. They didn't have any heat in the winter. They didn't have adequate clothing. It was extremely difficult for him, and but he doesn't want to talk about it. So you cannot ask him, and you can never let him know that you know. She said, don't let him know that I told you. So that made me even more curious, knowing that he had been in a concentration camp. And I was in a difficult situation because I couldn't let him know that I knew, and I couldn't ask him directly, but I was burning with curiosity. I really wanted to know much more. So for more than 20 years, I kept asking, but in ways that were very indirect. I was always trying to push him or cajole him, or I was always trying to find a way to get him to talk about it, and he always resisted. So yeah, there was nothing I could do until one day I started the oral history, and we were at home, and someone else was recording it, and I don't know, it just suddenly came out. I said, so where were you when the war ended? And that's when it came out. That's when he started talking about it. So I recorded a series of oral history interviews with my father over the next several years, and that's the basis of this book.
Wow, that's amazing. And he was willing to share everything afterwards.
I don't think he told me everything, but he shared a lot.
Yeah, he shared a lot.
Well, I mean, relatively a lot. But I'm sure that there's a lot he did not tell me.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah,
I understand.
Yeah.
I mean, for one, I guess I thank you for your persistence. Because I could imagine, as a father, realizing, hey, man, I have quite a persistent daughter. But this. I'm blown away by your father's story. It's so unfortunate what happened to him. But this right here is a whole chapter in annals of world history. And to just imagine that someone from St. Martin was able to live through that experience and then eventually tell that story, it is so powerful, because it is one of great endurance. It is one, of mental capacity, and especially because we know very well it's before our eyes what happened to the Jews and the like during World War II. But rarely do you hear about a black person, in Europe at that time, specifically in a concentration camp. And, it's more like a footnote opposed to at least just a page. So one of the things I'm curious about is, from your observation, did that affect while growing up, did your father's experience affect his relationship with your mother by any chance? Or
it's hard to say. I think it must have, maybe in subconscious ways. But that was a whole chapter of his life that he didn't want to reveal.
Okay.
So even to close family members, he didn't want to talk about it for most of his life. So it must have affected the relationship. But it's very hard to say. Yeah. Because he didn't know that he was in trauma. We didn't know that he was in trauma. And I think that only by talking about it, as he did during the oral histories, did he begin to emerge from it.
Yes.
Speaking about trauma is one of the very few ways in which a person can begin to heal.
Yes. And the thing about it is, it's powerful because even in our, as we say, modern time, trauma, mental health, your past experiences, even that is still seen as taboo. So you can imagine, much less in his era, his generation, where the tendency was to keep everything within. Don't tell people your business whatsoever. And so I think that means a lot.
That's exactly right.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, there wasn't even a term for post-traumatic stress disorder until the 80s, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So it wasn't really even identified as a condition.
Indeed.
Even though a lot of people were suffering from it, because at that point there were still a lot of Holocaust survivors.
Yes.
And other survivors of the Nazis, and other survivors of different genocides and other forms of trauma. I mean, it's not all war. There are many forms of trauma.
It could be hurricanes even.
Absolutely.
You name it, yeah.
If you look at what St. Martin has endured over the last 30 years, I mean, 4 major hurricanes, that has to be traumatic.
Yes.
Absolutely. I mean, collectively and individually.
Indeed.
So, there are many forms of trauma, and a lot of the post-traumatic stress that people suffer, a lot of it is subconscious, a lot of it is just not understood. And as you say, a lot of people do feel that mental health issues are taboo, and they don't want to talk about them.
For sure. So one of the things I'm curious about is if you can recall, what stories do you recall about that your father shared with you about growing up in St. Martin, and what led him to particularly move to New York specifically? Well,
growing up in St. Martin, I think, was just a wonderful experience. It was a wonderful place to grow up. It was very beautiful here. It was very unspoiled. People, how can I say? Not everybody could make a living, so they emigrated, as we know. A lot of emigration. His parents emigrated to the Dominican Republic, and they were cane cutters for a long time. But and then people in my father's generation emigrated to Aruba and Curacao for the refineries.
Yes.
My father and his siblings did that as well. But for the people who were able to make a living here, and my grandparents were also among them, they emigrated, but then they returned, and they made a wonderful living here. My grandfather, my father's father, raised cattle. He raised goats. He had hundreds of head of goats, and a lot of cows, apparently, I think dozens of cows, and a lot of animals, and they were totally self-sufficient. They were able to provide their children with a wonderful life, and very, very prosperous. They were very successful. So my father, I think, had an excellent childhood, he and his siblings. But then, as they got older, there was not enough work here for everybody, so they did have to emigrate. So I think that it was through exposure to different environments that my father became curious about some of the rest of the world. And I think in the mid-30s, he started to get jobs on, I think, merchant ships. Mm-hmm. And some of them went to the Netherlands. So he had a little exposure to the outside world, and I think it just stimulated his curiosity.
Yes.
So, and he had a sort of an adventurous spirit. So that was why he started working on merchant ships somewhere in the mid to late 30s. And those merchant ships were sailing between the Caribbean, North America, and Europe. So that's how he got to Europe in the first place. So I think that was your question, right? How did he? Yeah. So do you want me to?
Yeah, because
is this the time now to explain how he got involved in the war? And
yes.
Okay.
Yes, I was just.
I don't want to
go
jump
that.
ahead.
That's okay. Go right ahead.
Okay. So what happened was he was on a ship.
Well, I will add, how old was he, if he knew? When
he was born in 1912.
Okay.
And this is the mid to late 30s. So in 1940, he was on a merchant ship, and it was sailing from Cardiff in Wales over to Greece, which obviously took them through the Mediterranean. So when they got to the area between Tunisia and Sicily, Italy had just entered the war at that point. It was let me see, it was June of 1940. And when they got to the area between Tunisia and Sicily, the ship struck a mine, which, as we know, is a bomb, and the ship sank. But the Italian Navy rescued the crew. So that was how my father became a political prisoner in Italy. That's what happened. Mm. So for the next 4 years, he was a captive there in Italy, and he was transferred through a series of internment camps there. And in 1944, the Germans had a presence in the, they took control of the Italian camp system. And so by 1944, they were taking all the prisoners from the Italian internment camp system, and they were deporting them to concentration camps in the areas that the Germans, controlled. Mm-hmm. So they took most of the Jewish prisoners and sent them to Auschwitz. But the non-Jewish prisoners were sent to other camps. And the camp where they sent my father was called Mauthausen, and it's in Austria, not too far from the Czech border. Hmm. So that's where he was, and he was in that camp for about a year until the camp was liberated by the U.S. Army at the end of the war. Hmm. Yeah.
And so, of course, with the most difficult part, what was it like being in those camps? What were some of the things he witnessed or even personally experienced, and then what kept him throughout those years?
Yeah. Well, he witnessed atrocities daily, I think. He was always, I think that this is part of the trauma, or a large part of the trauma. He was always wondering if he would be the next one to die. Always. And he said that the most terrifying part was at night when the SS would barge into the barracks and they would call out a number, because every prisoner had a number. Absolutely every prisoner in the internment in the concentration camp system. Mm-hmm. They each had numbers which substituted their names. So every prisoner knew his number. So they would call out, the SS would call out a number, and they would take that prisoner, and then you would never see him again. The SS committed atrocities that were unimaginable. I mean, you, in your wildest, most depraved imagination, you can't begin to I don't know if you could create some of the atrocities that they committed in the entire camp system. But Mauthausen in particular was the only camp in the entire system that was specifically designated to work its prisoners to death. And the way they did that was, the concentration camp at Mauthausen was constructed because of a quarry. It sat right on top of the largest granite quarry in Austria. And they built a camp there because they needed a captive labor force, or a slave labor force, to work the quarry. And that's how a lot of prisoners died. They were starving. The Nazis also used to starve their prisoners because they wanted to keep their prisoners in a constant state of weakness so that they couldn't rebel.
Yeah.
So everybody, or not everybody, a lot of people in that camp were subjected to very, very extremely hard labor in the midst of their starvation. So that's how they were able to work a lot of people to death. So my father did see that, and he himself was singled out for some abuse because he was black. He came to the prison. He came to the concentration camp with a group from Italy. So all the other prisoners with whom he entered the camp were Italian. So he was the only non-Italian and the only black person in that group, because they had groups of prisoners entering pretty much every day. So he told me of the experience on his first night in the camp, when they all had to line up. They were stripped naked. They all had to line up, and an SS officer singled him out and kicked him. And of course, there was nothing he could do, and he had to pretend that it was nothing, because if he showed any kind of anger or anything, that would give them an excuse to kill him.
Yeah.
So he just had to tolerate this abuse.
They basically were set on breaking every man's spirit.
Absolutely, of course. They really specialized in intimidation.
Yeah.
Another atrocity that was routinely committed in that camp was, the quarry was, the quarry was like a big hole, a huge hole, right? So the camp was on top of it. So there was a kind of a cliff, and that was, the quarry was down at the bottom and the camp was up on top. So the SS would routinely throw prisoners over the cliff, which was 150. It was a more than 150-foot drop. It was a 50-meter drop to the bottom. So they would throw prisoners over there, and that was a way of intimidating the others. They were constantly trying to intimidate the prisoners and torture them mentally and physically. There were a lot of different forms of torture.
Yeah.
It's Austria. It's cold. The winters are extremely cold.
Yeah, so that in itself is brutal.
Absolutely. Just that alone. And of course, there was no heat in the barracks, in the prisoner barracks. So one form of torture was to, at night, they would throw water on a prisoner and make him completely soaked, and then put him outside and make him spend the night outside. So of course, in the morning, he was frozen to death. And that was another form of torture that they used. Any kind of horrible torture that you can think of is what the SS did, and all the Nazis.
Now, I know that in the past, St. Martin's in school, children also learned German. Did your father learn German? And so did he, understood what was happening as well?
He was able to learn German because of his knowledge of Dutch. He was able to learn it easily. He was able to understand all the German he heard because of his knowledge of Dutch, and he was able to learn to speak it. But that happened in the Italian camp system, because maybe 1 or 2 years after he was in the Italian camp system, where, by the way, he was treated humanely. The Italians treated their prisoners humanely, or in the camps where my father was, they were all treated humanely.
Yeah.
But in that system, when the Germans came in and took control, he was forced into interacting with German soldiers. It wasn't the SS; it was the regular army.
Gotcha.
But he was forced into interacting with them. So that was how he learned German. He learned to speak
probably
it.
kind of helped him out as well, I assume.
Well, I think in your original question you asked about how he was able to get through the experience.
Yes.
And what you just said reminds me of, I think, one of the main reasons, and that was his knowledge of languages. As a St. Martiner and as an Afro-Caribbean, he was multilingual to begin with,
Yes.
even before he went over there. So, in that particular camp, and maybe in many camps, they allowed prisoners with language skills to live longer than other prisoners because they could serve as interpreters. So that became one of my father's nicknames. They called him the translator because he knew English, Dutch, German, Spanish, Italian, and Papiamentu. So, he didn't use the Papiamentu, but he did use all those other languages. He was able to communicate with a lot of people because of his knowledge of all those languages. And the prisoner population at Mauthausen was very, very diverse. There were people there from every country in Europe and from every continent. So he was able to communicate with a lot of people in that camp. So that's one reason why they kept him alive. Another reason for his survival was that he was not assigned to work in the quarry. So that saved him. That was very, very helpful in preserving the little bit of strength and health that he had. Yeah.
Okay, and just before we go to our break, I guess one of the other questions I had for you was, how did he describe the setting of the camp as well?
The setting, you mean the location?
Location, but even inside of the concentration camp, were they mashed together? Were they chained together? Like, what was it like inside there as well? Did he ever describe that?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, he talked a little bit about the barracks, the prisoner barracks.
Okay.
Let me see. No, they were not chained.
Okay.
They were not chained together. The SS came to the barracks every day to take roll call to make sure that everybody was in there, nobody was missing, and they were very meticulous in all of their record keeping, and I'm glad for that because my father's records are not only in Austria but also in the central Nazi archives in Germany. So he talked a lot about, well, not a lot, but he talked about the work detail. He was assigned to cut down trees. He was a lumberjack. That was his job in the camp. So they were able to leave the camp every day, and of course they were guarded, but they were able to leave and cut down trees in the forests around the camp every day. So he did talk about that. And in the winter, that was helpful because at least they were always moving, and that kept him warm while he was working. But then at night, when it was time to sleep, they were. I don't know how he endured that cold. I just don't know how he did that.
Yeah. They definitely weren't afforded jackets and coats.
That's for sure.
Yeah. And I'm curious, what number was assigned to him?
It was 76548. And he remembered the beginning of that number for the rest of his life. He remembered that it began with 76,000 something. And he remembered the color of the emblem on his uniform because he was a political prisoner, and the prisoner classification system was color-coded. And red was for political prisoners, and that's what he was. So the prisoner's emblem was very, very important, very important. And it was on the left side of the shirt, which he remembered, and it was on the right pants leg. He didn't mention that, and I found that out.
Okay.
But he did remember certain details, absolutely, and he told me a lot of them, a lot of the ones that he remembered.
And so later today at the Government Administration Building. You will be launching your book, An Afro-Caribbean in the Nazi Era from Papiamento to German. That will be at the Government Administration Building at 7 p.m. So I definitely do invite anyone and everyone listening to this interview, please invite some friends, some families, because you need a copy of this book. This is a book that is a must-read, but in addition to that, persons will be able to get copies online.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. At Amazon.com.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay,
yeah.
great.
It's
So we're going to
available.
take a quick break and we'll be right back.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to the News Behind the News with Rav Kintab on Mix 94.7 FM. And thank you for joining me on today's program. And if you was listening from the beginning, thank you for still sticking around. As this afternoon, I am joined with Miss Mary Romney, who wrote the book An Afro-Caribbean in the Nazi Era from Papiamento to German, a book that you need in your library. And joining her as well, actually, is a producer and director, Miss Stephanie Dolbeck. So, Stephanie, good afternoon to you, and thank you for being here as well.
Thank you for the honor of being here also.
Okay, great. So, could you tell us a bit about how did you two meet and the follow-up to the book, which will be taking place in the form of a film production?
Yes. Well, in 2018, I was researching. I'm a historical documentarian, and I was researching specifically minority groups that were at that time in the records of Mauthausen. And especially because it is all our shared history, and I wanted to look at stories that haven't been told until now and that need to be told in order to understand or to get a bigger picture. And I was lucky enough to be connected to a professor in Vienna who did research on those minority groups and survivors. And that's how I was so fortunate to be connected to Mary and find out about Mary's father's story, how incredibly resilient and what an also unfortunate, but what an adventure he had to endure and how he survived this.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And then we started working on the idea of course, making a documentary out of this.
And how recent was this?
When it was?
Yeah.
We met in 2018, or we started connecting the first time in 2018 and saw each other for the first time in 2019 and then took it from there.
Okay. And one of the things that you was able to do, Miss Romney, is that you were able to actually travel and visit where the places that your father were.
Absolutely. I never really thought about what I was going to do. I didn't think much about what I was going to do with all that oral history.
Mm-hmm.
I really wanted it for myself and the family, future generations. But I never really thought about a book until after I came home from my first visit to Mauthausen. After my father passed away, about 2 years after my father passed away, we visited Mauthausen. My husband and I visited Mauthausen. And that was a really life-changing experience for me. So after that, I came home and I just started writing my impressions, especially how I felt about being there. I just started writing that down. I don't even know why I started writing it. And I don't know, eventually I just came to the idea of organizing everything in a book because I had the oral history recordings. So I said, well, I'll transcribe them just to see what they look like. And then from there I decided to organize it into a book.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
I could imagine it must have been beyond touching, to just be there physically and imagine, your father years ago being in a camp, being in those conditions.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
It was very emotionally impactful, very,
Mm-hmm.
very impactful. And I felt that it was giving me a chance to possibly walk in his footsteps, even if I didn't know exactly where he was. I knew some of the places where he was specifically, and I made sure that I walked in those spaces. But just being in that camp was very even the first day, I couldn't bring myself to set foot inside. That was very, very difficult for me. But yeah, it was. I'm very glad that I did it. It really it brought a lot of peace to me in the end.
And so, as far as this the film project is concerned, what's the current status of it? You can share that with us, Stephanie.
We are currently in the process of developing the script. We're at the end of that, and we have already interest of channels that are hopefully gonna co-produce this incredible project with us, and we're aiming for having everything set and ready for principal shooting by 2023.
Okay.
And hopefully also being able to share it as wide as possible and make it as accessible as possible too.
Yeah. And can you actually share with us and break down a bit the process of just, creating a script for a documentary, but even a docu-series?
Sure. Well, in that specific case, you already have an incredible story that now you face the challenge of narrowing it down to make it into a specific slot. We are aiming for a slot that is between 45 and 60 minutes long. And out of that book, that means, unfortunately, also needing to cut a lot of really essential things. So the challenge is to really find the happenings of Lionel's life that ended up to rapid change. And also, of course, his endurance and the hero story. That's kind of how you need to put it. How he endeavored out there as an adventurous young spirit, and how he endured the horrors of Nazi Germany, Nazi Austria.
Yeah.
And once you have some sort of a timeline set, you start writing an outline.
Gotcha.
And with 60 minutes, it's roughly 60 pages. And with a series, this could perfectly as well go into a series, because then you just take out these stages that you have previously deformed, and then shape a one episode out of each.
Yeah, out of each element.
Each happening on the course of the story.
Yeah, like I was sharing with you guys, basically I was introduced to this book and this story by a colleague of mine. Big up to Mr. G Money, who loves this book. Like, he was bragging about it because he's also besides being on radio, he's an actor as well, and he was just like, this would be an amazing screenplay, and he kept emphasizing like someone needs to make a manuscript out of this, and that was 2 months ago, and so again, it's just a pleasure to literally have you guys here and to have you, Ms. Romney, to share your story. And again, as a reminder, later today at the Government Administration Building, there will be the book launch that will be taking place at 7 p.m. And you can get yourself a freshly signed copy of your book, and as well as there will be some copies at the book fair, which will take place, I think, from June 2nd to 3rd. And you can get your copies on Amazon as well. Again, the title of the book is An Afro-Caribbean in the Nazi Era, from Papiamentu to German. And so with that, Miss Stephanie, I actually have another question for you, which relates to the production of this. Like, around how much time does it take actually, to 4 months, 6 months, a whole year? How long do you estimate? Because I guess you would have to shoot in all the different countries he's been. Would that be the case? Yes,
we want to make it as authentic as possible, and also for people to be able to relate of where he came from. I mean, what Mary has as subline in the title, From Papiamentu to German, if you translate it in a visual form, it's from paradise to hell, really.
Wow.
Because you can also see it on the book title and how the color is fading. And
yes,
I think that aspect is really important to translate that into the visual storytelling of it.
Yeah.
And that's why we're here now. We're trying to find locations that are as close as possible to when Lionel had lived here, and the moment where he was taking off and heading into the world without knowing anything about what was going to happen.
Okay.
And that shift, and also then necessary amount of locations and also sound. Yesterday we were really fortunate to be able to potentially find a soundtrack that would be really fitting to this theme, which is also really essential. Finding, the necessary storyline in an audio level.
Yeah.
And we're hoping, it feels like it is in fortuitous hands.
Yeah.
And
Like you're birthing something amazing.
yes.
Yeah.
And please tell your friend that we need all the help in the world.
Oh, he'll be more than willing, and you definitely already have my help because I'm already thinking, even for shooting ideas. I don't know. I know that the great Miss Linda Richardson is also with you guys assisting. Column Bay would be a great area to go and shoot traditional St. Martin homes. There are some quite a bit of old St. Martin homes in French Quarter as well. The part with him going on the boat, I think the best area is at the end of the boardwalk, close to Greenhouse, where those fishermen still are. I got you.
Maybe we can go scouting
I got
together
you.
afterwards.
Listen, we definitely can. If anybody can contribute. I mean, I already have enough ideas I can share with you on that. So that's for sure. For sure. If you want to bring this alive, you got my full support.
Amazing.
And even with that, are you independently shooting? What's it like? Getting a budget. Of course, you have to be compensated, and
Yes.
As
of
it
now,
is professional work too. So
as of now, I have funded it myself.
okay.
But I just know that since it is all of our stories. It combines. It's necessary for all of us.
Yes.
It's also necessary to understand for Austrians and to German viewers to know about it.
Yes.
Because as of now, we have been told one narrative, which is incredible by itself.
Yes.
But there are so many more perspectives that add to the bigger picture.
Yes.
So that's why there was no other way than to step forward and do it independently. But I have been doing a lot of documentaries before, and I'm connected to
the industry. Yes.
And we have one channel that is already supporting us in the development of the script.
That's amazing.
And from that moment on, it is one step after the next, but I am really positive that we're going to find the necessary co-production partners to make this happen.
Perfect. And like I said, after this, I'm going to do some brainstorming to get you some more help with resources where that's concerned. One thing that comes to mind, Ms. Romney, actually, is what was it like listening to your father share about the moment of freedom?
It was very. It's hard to describe because he, throughout that whole chapter, that whole episode in his life, he was constantly being mistaken for something that he wasn't, constantly. So at the moment of liberation, when the Americans came through, they thought that he was one of them. They thought that he was American. And I think that could be one reason why they treated him as well as they did. But it was so ironic. They thought that he was a soldier. He had spent the whole war as a civilian, his whole life as a civilian. He had spent the whole war as a pawn in this horrible game of death, destruction, and violence. And he was a total victim with absolutely no protection, always unarmed. He had never, ever touched any kind of firearm in his entire life. And when the Americans came through and they thought that he was one of them, the first thing they did was to give him a gun, a weapon, some kind of a rifle or some kind of a machine gun or something. I don't know. But it was so ironic that, first of all, that they thought that he was one of them, and second of all, that they thought that he was a soldier, having spent the entire war as a civilian in captivity.
Yeah.
So it was very ironic. There were so many ironies in that whole experience, and that was certainly one of them.
What comes to mind with that is that old, I think, African proverb, when elephant fights, the grass suffers. Just your dad, as you rightfully shared, was a civilian, just a humble man who wanted to work and provide for himself, his family, see the world, and get caught up in this unfortunate global event. And another thing that Stephanie shared, that really came to mind now, as relates to just the cover of the book, is really the contrast as well in setting, because coming from the Caribbean, with all the vibrancy around us, to now be in a concentration camp, and more so in a very cold country, where you're used to warmth, you're used to sand, you're used to very manly, happy people. I could imagine all of that was like an attack to his spirit, in a sense,
That is exactly right. I mean, I've never heard it expressed as eloquently as you just did. I mean, it's amazing that you would say that. I can't believe you said that. It's just fantastic, because that's exactly what I mean by from Papiamentu to German. It does mean the role of languages in his survival, but it also means exactly what you just said, coming from this beautiful, vibrant, idyllic, tropical environment, and that's Papiamentu, to German, which was this horrible, colorless, and extremely hostile environment, coming from an environment where he was loved and respected to an environment where he was not only a slave, but also a victim to not only the whims of the Nazis, but also the systematic oppression of their whole perverse way of thinking. I mean, they considered black people and people in the specifically targeted groups, the Jews and LGBTQ community and Roma and Sinti, they considered all of those people to be subhuman. And for him to be victimized by that type of thinking, that's what, the German in the title also represents to a certain extent. I'm not saying that I feel this way about German people or that he felt that way about German people, but it's the languages, what the languages represented. Papiamentu represented his roots, and German represented his experience there in the war.
At the end of you being able to sit down and record your father, what was that like? How did he express himself to you about finally coming out with his story, or did he just give it up and walk away? Perhaps what was it like?
He didn't talk about what it was like for him to finally discuss it. He didn't have the meta discussion. He just talked, and for me it was totally fascinating. It was better than, because everything I visualized everything he said.
Yeah, I can
it was
imagine.
so evocative, and it was better than the movies. It was better than television. It was better than. I mean, it was. I don't know. I won't say it was entertainment, but it was fascinating. I was always fascinated by, but of course he repeated himself a lot. I don't know if he realized that he was doing that, but he did repeat himself a lot. So I said before that he told me a lot, and then I said no, relatively a lot. I don't think he told me very much in comparison to what he actually experienced. I don't think he told me the worst of it, because I don't think he wanted me to suffer. I don't think he wanted to scare me. He did tell me about some of the atrocities and so forth, but I don't think
it could be
he
that
told me
maybe
the
he
worst.
even forgot because it was so traumatic too.
Absolutely. He might have forgotten a lot. And he did get confused sometimes. I know he did, because I read, after when I was putting the book together, I was doing research, I read some things that were in conflict with what he said. I mean, not very important things, but like the color of his emblem.
Yes.
At first he said it was green, and then he said it was red. He went into, they put the prisoners, on the first night, they put the prisoners in a huge room, and he said that was a crematorium. Well, it wasn't. It was the shower room. He got confused. I mean, other prisoners told him things that he told me, and like being like that room was the crematorium. That's what a prisoner told him, and he believed it. But that couldn't have been true. It wasn't. I mean, I saw the crematoria at Mauthausen, and that's not what they looked like. And I saw the room where he was on that first night, and it wasn't a crematorium. So, a little bit of confusion here and there. So, but I think that his memory was much clearer than I thought was possible, because more than 40 years had passed, and he still remembered things like the part of his number and the color of his emblem. He got it confused in the beginning, and then he got it right. So, but I was amazed at how much detail he was able to remember accurately, because I did corroborate a lot of what he said in many history books that I read in the research for the book. So I know that a lot of what he said was absolutely and totally correct, but I would have believed him anyway, I mean, because his memory was so good. I know his memory was good because the things that he told me about his childhood, which was longer ago than what he experienced in the war, right? That was much longer ago. I know that a lot of the things he told me about his childhood and the history of St. Martin were also corroborated not only by what I've read what I've been able to read in a little bit of history that I've been able to find about St. Martin, but also in what other people have said. So I know that his memory was very good, very clear. His long-term memory was really excellent. So, but to answer your question, I was always fascinated by what he said, and time stood still. At the end of each of our conversations, I couldn't believe how much time we had spent, because it seemed like only a minute, and it was always 1 or 2 hours. So I really enjoyed it. I just loved listening to him.
Yeah, and I must also add that I do appreciate seeing a picture of him too. You added a picture of him in his younger years in 1945, and another one in 1998. What year did he pass away, by the way?
2004.
Okay, so he lived quite a long life.
He did.
Yeah. Wow. There's something here that just stood out to me. I think is worth reading. A quote of your dad here, based on your oral history, where he said, "After the war, I was in Le Havre, France, and they had a place, they call it the Billet, where all the soldiers came. I went in there, and there was an American military woman, and she looked at me and said, 'Oh, do they allow these black people in here too?' A guy said, 'Lady, this is France. This is a democratic country. They don't have this system of racial segregation here.'" Now, it's interesting in that time. So it's interesting to read this also because, we also discussed, the racial element that even with France itself as a colonial territory, besides what we know, for example, they did to Haiti, but even as it relates to the war and how they treated the soldiers from the French colonies in the war, it's still interesting to see that, your dad, in a sense, was able to be dignified to an extent, by this interaction that he had in France. And that leads me, I would like to also get your perspective, Stephanie, as far as it relates to, how do you go about, again, you can't put everything in a film, but how do you go about, I guess, choosing those provocative moments, that resonates with the viewer in your production?
It's a good question. It is actually a small line of choosing the right moments. Because what is most important to portray is that Lionel was not only so adventurous and resilient, but he was also really incredible about staying true to himself, even in the harshest moments he had to endure. And like Mary said, with the Nazis, there was no clear way how they treated black people. They treated Afro-Germans differently than Afro-Caribbeans or Afro-Americans. There was no clear line. But of course, there was absolutely some horrific moments that also Lionel had to endure. And just by reading some of the oral history dialogues that Mary has written down in her book and how they would talk to him is completely different to how they would talk to another prisoner. And those moments are going to be shown as part of his survival in Mauthausen also. And just how I always feel and like to say that looking at Lionel through the lens of film makes me remind him, or makes me remind myself of the picture of a tree. Because he kept being so calm, he kept being so strong and knowing where his roots were. And due to that, also kind of playing the Germans towards that with his incredible knowledge of languages. And he definitely was really smart and charming and did everything with his background and survived.
Yeah.
And that is important to be shown in the film.
Yeah, that's glad you mentioned that, actually. And while I would like to go on so much more, I realize we reached the end of the interview. So, Miss Romney, I'm curious if you can share with us what would be one takeaway, one reason why you'd like someone to get from this book.
I think, excuse me.
That's okay.
I'm sorry. I think in my heart, what I really want people to do is to take this book as an example of why they should do oral history with their own elders. I really want to inspire, I want to encourage people to record oral histories with their elders. If you want to understand, if you want deeper self-knowledge, if you want deeper knowledge of your family and your community, it could very possibly, or I believe that it resides in the memories of the oldest people in your family. I think it's very, very important for young people to take the time to interview the oldest people in their families, and because I tell people all the time, you're not doing this for yourself. I mean, it will lead you to deeper self-knowledge. It's very spiritually nutritious, okay? But you should really not do it for yourself, as beneficial to you as it is. You should be doing it for your grandchildren's grandchildren, because they will probably never know your grandparents, right? So, why not let those future generations know the past generations? That's very, very important.
Yeah.
It strengthens your roots.
Yes.
I mean, we all know what happens to a tree, as Stephanie is talking about, this metaphor of my father as a tree, which I think is an absolutely brilliant metaphor. But we know what happens to a tree when the roots are destroyed, or when the roots are severely affected adversely.
It withers and dies.
So that's exactly right. That's exactly what happens. So, we in the African diaspora have had our roots cut. We have been transplanted, and we have grown new roots throughout the diaspora, which has been wonderful. We've contributed enormously to every environment where we have been able to live and survive and flourish and even suffer. But your roots are your strength. Absolutely. I mean, that's what keeps a tree anchored. So I think it's the same for people.
Great. Well, ladies, I would like to thank you so much for gracing this program with your presence and voices. And again, just one more reminder that you too can get yourself a copy of this book, An Afro-Caribbean in the Nazi Era, from Papiamento to German, later this evening at the Government Administration Building at 7 p.m., where the book launch will be held of this book written by Miss Mary Romney. So I would like to thank you guys so much for joining us on today's program, and be sure to join us again. Do take care, and thanks for listening.